I'm Miriam Bale. I'm the artistic director of the Indie Memphis Film Festival. And thank you for joining us on this panel today on cinematic thirst and film criticism. It is my great honor. Well, first of all, welcome to IndieTalks. And I want to say all IndieTalks are free and sponsored by the Hohenberg Foundation, which we're very grateful for. And I'm very grateful to be on a panel of some of my favorite critics who I will introduce now. To my left is Hunter Harris. She's a staff writer at Vulture, New York Magazine's entertainment and culture news site, where she writes about movies covering everything from Hollywood's Me Too reckoning to award season and more. She joined the site in 2016 as an associate editor. She was included in the paper magazine's 100 People Taking Over 2019 as a name to watch, and has appeared on NBC's Today, Good Morning America, PBS NewsHour, BBC World News, and many more. Previously, she was the entertainment editorial assistant at Refinery 29, where she covered music, movies, and TV. She graduated from Emerson College with a degree in journalism, and she's a primary expert in the field of Bradley Cooper lusting. And then next to Hunter is Khaosan Collins. He is a film critic for Vanity Fair. His writing has appeared in The Ringer, the Los Angeles Review of Books, The Reverse Shot, and The Brooklyn Rail. He writes crosswords for The New Yorker and The New York Times, and the American Values Crossword Club. He lives in Brooklyn. And next to Cameron is Nick Pinkerton. He's a Cincinnati-born, Brooklyn-based writer focused on moving image-based art. His writing has appeared in Film Comment, Sight and Sound, Artforum, Freeze, Reverse Shot, Four Columns, The Baffler, Harper's Village. I could go on. The Village Voice, many publications. He's also publications include monographs on Mondo movies and the films of Ruth Beckerman, and a forthcoming book on Simon Lang's Goodbye Dragon Inn. So let's give a big round of applause for our esteemed panel. So today is an interesting topic that I'm looking forward to. It is about cinematic thirst, which is a sort of internet slang term, thirst for lust, for openly being lusty over someone. And there's a long history of this as a thread in especially American film criticism, and both positive and negative. So we'll discuss the whole spectrum today. I'll start out with some that is maybe on the positive side. Pauline Kael, one of the most renowned American film critics, wrote a 1975 essay called The Man from Dream City, and she describes Cary Grant is the male love object. And in this, she compares him to other male sex objects and says, Gable is an intensely realistic sexual presence. You don't fool around with Gable, but with Grant there are no pressures, no demands. He's the sky that women aspire to. And as Christine Newland has written recently in Sight and Sound, she described Pauline Kael's interest in the voluptuous side of film acting and stardom is present everywhere in her work once you look. From her capsule reviews of Depression-era comedies right up to her retirement in 1991, Kael found male beauty, sensuality, and physicality wherever she could. And she wrote thrillingly about the response it would garner in an audience. Another positive example is Molly Haskell, who wrote really beautifully about Robert Redford. And another good example is, more subtly, is Molly Haskell's partner, Andrew Sarris, who is not known for his lust, but if you ever is known for cataloging American film and auteurism, but if you've ever seen his introductions and his love of what he has famously described as his favorite movie of all time. Oh my God, what's Andrew Sarris's favorite movie of all time? Lola Montez, sorry. Of Lola Montez. He writes completely in a way where lust of starlets is at the forefront, and that informed his partner Molly Haskell's work too in their look at women actresses. And so these are some of the positive examples I'd like to bring up. So I'll ask the panelists, where do you see thirst in film criticism as a necessary and very, or do you think that, I'll ask, where do you see it as, what are some positive examples of thirst in film criticism? Maybe it's easier to start with the negatives.
Yeah.
There's lots of negatives. Or I'll ask this of like, with the examples that I brought up, Pauline Kael, Andrew Sarris, Molly Haskell, do you feel like that these sort of foundational American film critics especially Pauline Kael has many Kaelites. Oh my God, what are they called?
Kaelites?
Kaelites, thank you. Pauline Kael has many imitators, and as does Andrew Sarris. Do you think that those critics form that structure and theme of lust being important for looking at movies?
I think when we talk about thirst as being a through line in American criticism, there's maybe a couple different levels on which it operates. There's the very face-forward sort of situations that we're talking of. I mean, when you bring up Andrew Sarris, I recall seeing Molly introduce Gone with the Wind at Film Forum and mentioning that Andy, her still living husband at the time, had seen the movie some 40 times and didn't like the movie at all. He just likes Vivien Leigh in it. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's a very, very good instance of maybe where Andy was coming from.
Exactly.
But at one and the same time, I think that there are critics who can be extremely attuned to the sensual appeal of film going, where that attunement doesn't necessarily attach itself to singing love songs to a particular actor or actress. It's more just the actual erotics of film going, right, where it's somewhat sublimated, perhaps. It's not so much saying, Burt Reynolds' pert mustache drives me up a wall, but finding ways to...
That's a Molly Haskell paraphrasing.
Yes. All of which is a roundabout way of saying, I mean, I think certainly the tradition of like writing MASH notes to favored performers is one way in which traditionally an erotics of criticism has been practiced, but it can also sort of find its way into the cracks, which is to say, everything sounds like a dirty double entendre now. Getting very Benny Hill up here.
But looking at like the essence of film criticism, I think some of these critics that I mentioned is that it's looking at bodies and faces on screen, hopefully projected huge and in a way that you can stare and ogle, that you're not permitted in life, and that's what the camera does, and that's what we do. Mm-hmm. Okay.
I mean, I think ultimately, can you hear me? Sorry. Should I? Okay. I think ultimately a lot of these... Okay, thank you. I can scoot up. What's so interesting to me is like, it's just all about desire. It's not so much about calling someone like ugly or hot or something like that, but just the way desire moves through these movies and the way that it sort of impacts how we see the actors and their performances. And that's what is like the most important part about like this sort of idea of thirst and criticism, and beyond just like making jokes on Twitter, is like looking at, like, I mean, just voyeurism, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about it for me is, well, first of all, I'm of an age where I wasn't really a huge Tumblr user, but I was very aware of how things like lust inform all the movie screenshots that we've all seen all over Tumblr, and also Twitter. And maybe my friends are unusually horny, but I don't think so. I think they're characteristic of, they're horny, but I think they're characteristic of the way that people, particularly people who are young and falling in love with film through particular actors and through particular directors who have a way of filming actors, we attach ourselves to those realms of beauty. They really do inform the way that we watch films, but also not just beauty. I mean, I think you're not understanding someone like Steve Buscemi if you're not thinking about the way that his look interacts with the archetypes that he's often called upon to play. I think the whole Adam Driver lust happening right now is very much tied to, I mean, certainly, you can have Scorsese going around talking about what a great actor he is all day, but when I was at Telluride, all the women at Telluride were horny for Adam Driver, and that
older women especially.
Yes, the older women at Telluride were it was in the air, and Telluride is a place where the stars walk around, they're among you, and there's no boundary between the patrons and the celebrities. So you have hot Adam Driver, Star Wars guy, walking around, and people just going crazy. And of course, everyone at Telluride loved Marriage Story. I don't know that that's the reason, but I do think that things like celebrity beauty, star beauty, just inform our aesthetic judgment. I think as a critic, you have to be aware of that, but I think being aware of that is an asset. Like, just thinking about sensuousness is important. For me, like, seeing Lost in Translation when it first came out as a young person, I'm gay, but Sofia Coppola starts with a shot of Scarlett Johansson's butt, and the people that I watched it with, everyone was like, whoa, we've never seen a movie that was nominated for Oscars do this. And it all the boys had crushes. It was it's like a weird way that it interacts with, it interacts with your understanding of the film. Like, your understanding of a character even is in a way pegged to the body of the actor. And how do you, as a critic, be honest about the body of the actor without being violating of your relationship to that body, but be honest about it, I think, is like, how do you talk about it?
Well, that brings up a lot of issues, what you just said. There's the issues of where describing a body goes wrong, and
Right.
I realized another person who, in pre-discussing, who we didn't talk about, was Rex Reed, who's famous for some really horrifying descriptions of
And
bodies.
John Simon as well, though
Oh.
we're going back a little way.
What was the John Simon?
Well, John Simon was just famously incredibly cruel in his descriptions of actors and especially actresses through the 1960s, 70s, and he's still with us today at 178 years old. But yeah, John Simon was perhaps the worst or best, depending on your angle, at just being incredibly cutting in describing performers.
Especially women, I feel like.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing with Rex Reed.
Barbara Streisand, I think, fairly infamously, John
Yeah,
Simon.
there are so many examples that we could and probably will bring up of just atrocious descriptions of women's bodies. But that brings me back to my other point of what Cam said. Were you aware when you were watching that scene of Scarlett Johansson's bottom in the beginning of Lost in Translation of the female gaze and of something kind of different in that shot than the normal lusting camera that we see all the time?
Yeah, that's something that, when I saw that movie for the first time, I didn't know that terminology. I didn't really know anything about the gaze, but I did know that I was looking at something, really the way for me to understand this when I was watching it the first time was the way that it filmed Bill Murray. I'd never thought of him as an object of attraction before. And I don't think that the film, it doesn't exploit that overly so, but there's a softness to the way that he appears in that film that made him come alive to me as a sexual point of interest. Not for my own attraction, but just even the idea that Scarlett Johansson's character, whose butt we open with, who's eroticized immediately, is in some way attracted to this person, changes the way that I saw Bill Murray.
That's amazing, because just absolutely in comparison of other Bill Murray roles, you're seeing the charisma films. You're seeing Sofia Coppola is so good at filming charisma and clothes. He
Right.
looks, he's well dressed.
Right.
And all of
She
that.
can make a sad guy seem hot, which is really not my thing. So it's weird how she does that.
Did you? Well, that brings me, we might as well get into the meat of the issue of some of these things, because in talking about the female gaze, you mentioned Tumblr, which was a very woman-driven site, and a gay male and woman-driven site, I think. And some of that lusting in Tumblr you see also in Twitter, and new forms of criticism. I think Tumblr was more picture-oriented, but Twitter, it's mixing of pictures and short statements, and it takes a slightly different form, and sometimes it can be really succinct forms of criticism. And Hunter is a genius at cinematic lust on Twitter. Let's just give a hand for Hunter. You should look up Hunter Y. Harris.
Yeah. I don't know what I do that's that thirsty. I mean, I'm being serious.
What?
I don't know. I do think that, as you were talking about Tumblr before, I do think I sort of came of age at a time when I would just get on a Tumblr and there'd just be an insane number of gifs from the Social Network that was just so informative to me as someone who liked movies and wanted to write about them and think about them all the time, that just the way that you could see the Harvard guys' bodies, how they all looked alike, but they all looked a little bit different, and they were all so alpha male. I don't know. But I think those people on Tumblr could run laps around me. They're doing such incredible visual criticism that I am in awe of all the time. But I don't know. I think I keep it pretty clean.
You do keep it clean, but it also informs that it's more in a Malona, my brain, Manola Dargis writes criticism in a way, and there's a sort of energy in all of her writing, and the sort of ferociousness that is wonderful, and that you see it's just part of her character, and that comes through. And I think that same kind of ferociousness in a more playful way comes through in your criticism and in your but the thing that I would like to talk about is also I feel like you've mastered the form in certain ways, but they're imitators who are, especially when it's straight white men, who kind of do what you do, and it's very different.
No, I think it's important, and when people read my work, that they know that I'm a Black woman, and that's sort of the perspective that I have. So when I call Bradley Cooper ugly but hot, unfortunately, then this is who's saying it. It's not someone from a different identity. But yeah, I don't know. That's so weird to me that let me think. I do sort of feel like we're doing the work a disservice if someone is presented in such, that's the thing with Bradley Cooper, is in A Star Is Born, he labored to make himself look much more attractive than he usually does. He usually is unshaven, unkempt, whatever. But in this movie, what I thought was in A Star Is Born, what I thought was so fascinating is that he I interviewed his makeup artist, and she's I use self-tanner on him every morning, and at the before we shot certain scenes to make it consistent, I blew oxygen in his eyes to make them super blue. I had him grow out his hair, we would rough it up a lot. And I thought that was fascinating, that because it's so rare that we see actors and sort of that we see even men in life putting any effort into their appearance at all beyond shopping at Supreme. But no, I thought that was really fascinating that we're seeing a man really labor to make himself look beautiful, and it was just sort of I thought it was so, I don't know, sweet, cute, and then he shows up to the Golden Globes, in a white tuxedo, and it's God, okay, yeah, you're back to normal now.
The journey.
But but so those are the things that I'm really interested in. When people, not so much a lot of award season attention is dedicated to people to Nicole Kidman wearing a fake nose in The Hours, or to someone wearing a wig. That's good or bad. But the idea of making yourself look just a little different to achieve something within a character, I think, and achieve something within the emotional arc of this movie, to me, or presenting Bill Murray in a slightly different way, that's stuff that's fascinating to me, because you can't really quantify it, and you can't say, well, we made him like this, we made Bradley Cooper like this amount dark skinned. Like, it's not like that. It's, I just think it's so interesting.
It really is. But I won't ask you to comment directly on, but maybe I'll ask Cameron and Nick, how do you feel when you see like young straight white guys like having the same sort of lust over like?
But see, it's like, that's old news to me. It's
Okay.
like, we can all look at the profile we were talking about earlier, Scarlett Johansson. Like, that stuff has been so, I mean, I can think of so many reviews where men have commented on women's bodies and appearances and all this stuff.
Right.
And so that is like the sort of overriding narrative of criticism and of like bodies. And I hope I'm not being, I don't know, I don't feel like I'm being judgmental of someone's actual, like, the way their face is or something, but I'm just appreciating the way that they use themselves to build a character, to build up their art. And it's not so much a judgment of like, they're hot or they're not hot. And I think that's what a lot of the straight young white guys on the internet are doing, and it's so reductive to me, and it's like boring, and it's not funny, and it's just like, okay.
It's not funny, and it's also sort of not acknowledging that history that goes on with yours. Yours is like, it's acknowledging the power dynamic in the world, but especially in film criticism of a black woman looking at a white man is so
And holding
different.
him to my standard, which is
Right.
the whole, we live in a patriarchy that's racist, like, the whole narrative is the opposite, that I should be held to his.
Absolutely. And do you guys want to comment on that difference?
Well, first, I want to get back to something Hunter was saying before about sort of actors changing their appearance, because a huge subset of this for me that's really interesting is the gorgeous actor who gets ugly. I mean, I will never forget the Charlize Theron Monster campaign and all how, like, the Oscar reel of her in the bathroom, like splashing water under her armpits, which were not shaven because we're supposed to believe that she's extremely downtrodden in this film. And that was, I think, the first time that I saw an actor, was kind of watching live as over the course of a year, watching that sort of campaign spin out. And just the ways that we, like, the amount of value we assigned to the bravery of the troops who were getting ugly for an Oscar.
Wait, so what we were talking about before was Margot Robbie on the press tour for
Mary Queen of Scots.
Yes. Where she gave an interview where she was like, I really had to make myself ugly. And she says, and I swear, no, I swear this is like in the interview. She says, people like wouldn't look at me when I had my Queen Elizabeth makeup on. It was so isolating. And it's like, yeah, no, that's how people look. Like the rest of us are just ugly, and you're so beautiful. Like that's how it is.
Like moment, like peering into the other side of like, wow.
I can point you to an excellent episode of Tyra Banks's program that covers some of this same material.
Every makeover on America's Next Top Model is about this. But yeah, another thing about this that's really fascinating is that when I've met or seen actors who on screen were radiant and gorgeous to me, in person they're people. This is important to me because this is, for me, it's like the aestheticizing is a part of the film. When I see these people in real life, I think I'm gonna be, just uncontrollably unprofessional over how hot they are. And with one exception, there was like one time when I was in college where I saw something was being filmed in New York, and I saw a guy whose ass was really nice, and I said, I bet that's Chris Maloney, and it was. Beyond that time, I've never really been impressed. But there's something to be said also, just like, this is a part of the apparatus of movies, particularly sort of the Hollywood glamour, that when I realized that this was the movie that was a part of the chemistry of how attracted I was to a person, and also remembered that for so many of us, our sexual subject formation is often through images, through people that we're, I distinctly remember watching Who Framed Roger Rabbit as a kid, and I know for a fact that I first became attracted to bears because of Bob Hoskins in that movie. I'm just gonna tell you guys everything. Later in life, realizing that it's like, my sexual history is tied up in the media that I've consumed. Like I've gotten access to different kinds of bodies and realized my attraction to them through movies. So it's impossible to separate these two things. Really, just like to your point about, the guys who are making it awkward, it's just like, I don't need to feel like your dick is in your hand when you're writing about this. I'd rather not feel like that's what you're doing. Like, the way to write these things, I think, is if you're gonna really sort of delve into that, it really kind of has to be about you. You should be writing about the metrics of your own attraction, and not kind of exploiting other people's bodies in a way that would make them feel weird if they saw it. Like, there's a way to be really personal about your sexual attraction that takes the weight off of the person you're talking about, and just it's about you. You're talking about yourself. You're showing your own ass whether or not you want to. So you may as well just make that the subject of the piece. I think that's part of what's often missing. That, and for example, the Margot Robbie profile you're talking about, or Anthony Lane on Scarlett Johansson, or things like that. It's these weird signifiers of beauty that are not really telling me anything about the person. They are telling me something about the writer, but the writer does not know that they're only telling me something about themselves. And that's when it's really bad. I mean, the Anthony Lane example that I like is Elastigirl, because that is...
Should we quote that? Oh, I think you will be our dramatic
I'm glad you
reader.
asked.
Because he gets really weird.
Anthony
But
Lane.
it is all about him. Whereas with
And
the Margot
it
Robbie
is about
stuff,
him.
it could be about any young blonde actress, really.
Right. Like the Margot Robbie stuff is
essentially
like,
interchangeable.
you're saying she's a hot blonde. Is that all you're saying? You're saying this for 3,000
But
words.
she sounds like slow jazz or something.
Right,
he
a
says. It's
slow
like, that's
jam.
silly.
A slow
The
jam.
next girl next door, but only in Australia or something. Some stupid crap. But like, and it's like not the room for it, but,
The scenario in question
oh yeah.
is
And
it's
Anthony.
actually, they buried it.
Anthony Lane, the critic from the New Yorker, also writing about Scarlett Johansson, famously wrote about the lost in translation scene, but also said that when watching Under the Skin, that her breasts were uneven and she showed tummy fat, and that it made her more real, and that he was pushing. I'll find the exact quote, but
Yeah, he
he's
talks
just
about her like she's an actor getting uglier or getting
Right.
average for a role, which is not my impression of Under the Skin
yeah.
at all.
So what's being dramatized in The Incredibles 2 review is that Anthony Lane is watching the film with wife and children, and he's struggling against his tumescence throughout the film. Take your seat at any early evening screening of Incredibles 2 in the coming days. Listen carefully, and you may just hear a shifty sound as of parents squirming awkwardly beside their enraptured offspring. And why, kids? Because mommy just leaned over to daddy and whispered, "Is it just me, or does Mrs. Incredible kind of look like Anastasia in 50 Shades of Grey? You know, the girl in the red room with the whips and all?" And daddy just rested his cooling soda firmly in his lap, like Mr. Incredible tried very hard to think of algebra. As for how daddy will react later on during the scene in which Helen and the husky-voiced Evelyn unwind and simply talk, woman to woman, I hate to think, but watch out for flying popcorn. So Anthony Lane...
What a weirdo.
Yeah. Anthony Lane, like Mickey Rourke in Diner, is imagining that his erection will burst through the popcorn bag, sending kernels flying willy-nilly through the theater. This is nothing if not a great piece of American criticism.
It's the most adventurous way of writing about a Pixar franchise movie that I could. You just run out of ways, I guess, so you just get home.
Yeah.
I forgot about the 50 Shades of Grey comparison. That's really...
This guy's like 60, by the way. This is how he talks to his wife?
I have questions about, bring your wife into it. Now I have questions about the whole situation.
Well, it's also
And the kids,
fascinating.
It's like some Anthony Weiner stuff going
What are
on.
you talking about?
Well, it's also fascinating because he's choosing to write about a cartoon, and like, not only does she not have a realistic body, and it's like
She's
the
slim
exaggerate-
thick. She's slim thick.
She
but,
is slim
you know.
thick. She's very. We also know his type, obviously, the slim thick. But she's. But also, I think maybe from previous pushback he's gotten, he wouldn't write that way about a real woman, and so he's choosing to let it all fly.
Yeah.
A cartoon. And yet he gets pushback, but he's still doing it. He's still in that position and writing that. There's not, somehow something like that is not a fireable offense.
It's weird because that's the New Yorker, and that was a print piece. So if you have any vague sense of just how the New Yorker works, it's like, so this went through all the fact checkers, multiple editors. David Remnick read it before it went to print, and this is still here. Which I mean, frankly, I'm glad that it exists, because what would I do without?
Imagine if this was just sitting on his computer. Like, my God, a real loss for the culture.
But it makes you wonder, just like also just how, how the people who are responsible for wrangling and making, putting this writing into the world think about these things. Like I wonder if there was conversation at the New Yorker about that piece, and is it inappropriate? Is it a little weird to be writing about a kid's movie this way? We get that it's a kid's movie and that you don't care about the movie really, but you're talking about girl-on-girl action in a movie that is about CGI superhero family. And there are things in the movie that are worth talking about. There is an energy in the movie, but I just wonder how the people, I'm not saying that critics should all be assigned a sensitivity reader, but I do think that in this case, I wonder what the conversation was.
I don't know. I want to ask you, Nick, as our token white straight male.
Please.
How do you, you're someone who I can't think of egregious incidences like this in your work, and
That's
a lot.
correct. I've never been horny online. No one will ever catch me slipping. The haters would love it, but it's not going to happen.
Can you talk about how you balance a sensuous appreciation of, what we've been talking about, of this of bodies and faces on screen, and an awareness of your role as a white straight male, that there are certain things nobody wants to see you say?
Well, to speak a bit to the point that Hunter made, beyond anything else, it's more a matter of just thinking about where one can be of most use as a critic, and I don't think the most interesting thing I can possibly bring to the table is informing a readership of who I'm particularly horny for. I just don't really think that's the most value that I can bring to things. So I tend to, I won't say eschew these matters completely, and certainly there have been times when things have slipped into the old prose in years past. If somebody really wants to pick through my Village Voice reviews of Bollywood movies from 2008.
Give us a year? Yeah. Tell us where to look.
Yeah. All of which is to say, I hope that there is some kind of sublimated lust trickling through things. And I feel like there are certain situations in which, for example, if I were to write about, the relationship between Jess Franco and his various lovers / actresses, in cases where this is very much a collaborative effort and is very much in the films a reflection of someone who seems to take evident pleasure in being looked at, and a director who takes evident pleasure in looking. It's not that I would drive a long way around it. It's just a matter, again, of, I think, not even a elevated sensitivity or anything of that nature. Just, I don't think anybody needs to see me cartoon wolfing around online.
Well, it's just not interesting, you find.
Yeah, it's not interesting. It was, would be of no interest.
Well, you also wrote, that reminds me, you wrote, I think, really well of Joe Sarno, the softcore filmmaker, and I can't remember some of the details of that, but I remember it was very, very interesting writing. So how do you handle something like that?
Well, the Franco example is not too far afield of that. Yeah. These are films in which the filmmaker and performers are all, to a certain degree, collaboratively engaged in a project of very public exploration of sexuality, and the act of performing certain acts in public, the pleasure of being looked out at is very much a part of the game, and to leave that out would be to fail to basically engage with what the works are. So if I succeeded in doing so without slavering too much, then I'm happy.
But then, I mean, because then you're also in the Joe Sarno writing about, yeah, not just that action, but about all of this, the style and form around that, and that it's more than just bodies, but also attraction and sexuality is narrative. I mean, I think, and you see that in Joe Sarno films, and I think it's also a narrative of these narratives we create around actors.
Yeah, I mean, but
Adam Driver.
I mean, to take the instance of Sarno, who is a name not perhaps familiar to everyone, I mean, this is somebody who's very much operating on the margins. So right away, like the sort of industrial manufacture of desire narrative doesn't really apply to these films. These are not like high gloss Hollywood movies. These are Long Island swingers who are lolling around in recessed living rooms somewhere in Huntington, and who are operating very, very far outside of, again, that like image manufacturing mill. And I don't think you can look at Sarno, you can look at Sarno's career and think of this guy as being this exploitative ogre so much as somebody who cultivated certain situations, who brought people who were interested in exploring their sexuality together and gave them a framework in which to do so and make films that resemble art of a sort, outsider art, if you like. All of which is to say, like, the traditional narrative of the male overseer in puttees and monocle who is pressing down on their actresses with a lusty camera. I just don't think it really tracks in the case of Sarno. And I mean, I know you have a more than slight interest in the world of softcore.
I love softcore. Thanks for airing my dirty laundry too. But I love softcore formally. I love one of the cinematographer that we're honoring tonight, Sean Price Williams, has there's like a softness and a backlight to a lot of his shots that reminds me of what I like about softcore, the aesthetics of it. But but I also like, I'm not gonna say more.
But I like that. I mean, I like the connection you're making there between softcore and what Sean Price Williams does in his work, because something I've been thinking about since you pitched us this panel has just been, for me, watching films and writing about them is largely a matter of just keeping track of how a film is making me feel, when it's arousing, when it's disgusting, and just what are the things that are happening that are doing that to me. Just trying to be open to what a film is trying to make me feel and thinking about formally and otherwise just how I got there. And I just wonder, like, if you're someone who's, if you're not sort of in tune with the way that your own desire works, or if you're not thinking about recognizing sensuousness or eroticism in things where it might not always be apparent, I wonder, like, are you a good critic of Hitchcock if you don't know what desire looks like at the level of the camera? Because, I feel like it's kind of important to the things that he does, and it's not just about women's bodies. It's the erotics of the thrill of whatever it is the train going into the tunnel in North by Northwest. There's that, which is like as obvious as it gets and hilarious accordingly, but then there are just things in the mystery of so much of his work where I just feel like, horny, lusty are not quite the word, but they're tapping into a same kind of thing, an arousal, that I just think that if you're thinking about that and you're honest about it, I think you're understanding something about the movie. And I think that's really important. I think that's something that maybe gets confusing for people who then just wind up writing about, they like maybe mistake what's going on there for an opportunity to write about their own sexual attraction to a particular actor or something. I mean, I think about this with like David Edelstein and Gal Gadot in Wonder Woman, just like.
Oh, does anyone want to quote that? No, go ahead. Just not quote it. No, let's not quote it.
This is a sacred space. So
Okay,
no. But you know, where it's like, you know, if I peel back the things that I think are inappropriate in his review, there's something to be said for the fact that what he's talking about is something formally that the movie is doing, and the powerful woman image that you're getting of Gal Gadot, who's got a stature, who's like got a power walk, who's got like a certain angle in her face, and the movie is very good at picking up on these things. And that is actually something interesting to me to write about. And in order to kind of be attuned to that, you do have to be attuned, I think, to your own attraction to what's happening on screen. But I don't want to read your description of her curves. I want to read how this is a part of the images of the movie. You know, I mean, there are shots, speaking of Brad, they're Bradley, sorry. I know you don't like me to call him Brad, but you know, I mean, there are these shots of like Bradley Cooper on the set of American Sniper with like short shorts on that are deeply hot, but then you put him in the context of that movie, and it's like,
and it gets hotter.
I mean, it's the erotics of American masculinity in the context of that movie. You should know that that's what you're looking at. I mean, Clint Eastwood is someone who certainly knows what it feels like to be eroticized.
I have. Oh, go ahead.
No, go for it.
No. Well, you keep talking because I want to find something, because there was a recent, a recent autobiography, an article by Richard Brody about Clint Eastwood, where he talks about reading in Clint Eastwood's partner's autobiography that after some negative reviews by Pauline Kael, that he sent these reviews to a psychologist to have them analyzed, and the psychologist said that she was attracted to him and was like, and couldn't have him, so was taking it out in these negative reviews, which is frankly so untrue, because she's never someone who's hidden attraction. And I feel like that's something that would only come out against a woman critic.
Is that the inspiration for Play Misty for me? It just seems like something that he made into a movie.
Wow, I didn't think about that.
I mean, I'm kidding, but like that seems like that's
probably...
There are literally multiple films, many of them directed by Clint Eastwood, about the chaos energy unleashed by the sexual magnetism of Clint Eastwood. A little film called The Beguiled.
Beguiled, Iger Sanction. Yeah, I think that he is his therapist. He sent it to himself.
Like Trump's publicist.
But I mean, yeah, he's certainly someone who knows what it feels like to be eroticized in that way. And you know, I feel like, yeah, we just got to be honest about it. Also, when you hear actors talk about filming sex scenes or things in environments where they feel safe and where they feel good, they do also often talk about like the physical pleasure of being in a safe space and being able to be sexy and being able to do things on screen. So it's like it's on both sides, right? Like I feel like there's an interaction here, and in the best possible case, actors are projecting and films are projecting a certain kind of erotic image, and we are participating in it, but we aren't exploiting people on either side.
Right.
That's where it gets bad and weird.
I was going to say, back to what you're talking about Wonder Woman, I feel like a bad Wonder Woman review would not have addressed Gal Gadot at all. Would have just sort of flattened out her, the character of the movie, into woman, superhero, fights bad guys, whatever. But it's like flattening that desire doesn't really make any sense. And it is just like an illogical review of this movie because it misses so much of what it's trying to do. But when you become very leering and you're talking about curves and just things that, and not how they function in the narrative, but just like, I'm a man and this is how I respond to that, that's when it becomes so bizarre. Yeah. And that's something that I don't think, that just doesn't make sense to me even to write.
Yeah, because Wonder Woman, the idea of Wonder Woman being sexy, I mean, great. Like
right.
Everyone
It's like,
on that
okay, so
island
she's
is
sexy, and what else? Like, like we know that. We're in the theater already.
Right, we did pay to see the sexy Wonder Woman, so we're there.
This conversation is making me realize how fascinating it would be to hear from an actor's perspective about these things, like from the critical, like their use and relationship of that attraction is a tool, and it's fascinating. And I wonder how they feel about it.
Angelica Bastien has written about actors and beauty a lot, and it's something that she and I talk about a lot is actors that are so unwilling to engage with their beauty, and they are mostly men. I mean, like Leo DiCaprio, it's anything that he would ever address. I'm trying to think of anyone like.
I mean, mentioning Leo DiCaprio makes me think of Brad Pitt, obviously, and
Who
like
so engages with it.
He does.
And plays with it, and
does.
it's more than becoming ugly, but it is just being very playful. And I think it makes him a better actor, and once you just look past him being truly so handsome, he's working with our perception of him in a way that's really interesting.
Totally. There's that line in the new Tarantino movie. Well, first of all, there's just the way he's in public, like hiding his beauty, sort of, with stains on his shirt and goatee, but then playing with it on camera. And there's that line in the Tarantino movie where they say, like, "Oh, you're pretty. You're awfully pretty for a stunt man," or something. And he's like, "That's what they tell me." And I think that's the classic Brad Pitt line. It's like, he's so playful and engaging with it.
Since as early as like Thelma and Louise, like he knew what he was doing to us and to them, being the way that he was in that movie. And it's a part of the movie that he is this gorgeous object that these women suddenly come upon. And I think he in particular is aware of that. Leo DiCaprio kind of surprises me because of the way that I feel like everyone, at least I guess it was in middle school when it came out, but Titanic, I feel like Leo DiCaprio was when I learned the word twink. It doesn't apply now, but like
Twink to twunk.
but twink to twunk to The Revenant. But yeah, it's disappointing, and I agree that men in particular are really bad at this because male beauty is, I mean, like in particular in Western art, it's like you can't escape from it. Mm-hmm. It is strange that men have not always learned how to be sort of upfront and like engage with it and do something with it in a way.
Well, also because there haven't been as many women critics. There have been prominent ones that we mentioned, but I think there are much more visibly, and we can engage with the male as sex object in a way that we haven't been able to before, in a playful way, in a really self-conscious way, instead of just as like a marketing.
I mean, one name that would be, I think, worth mentioning here as somebody who wrote so wonderfully about things going on underneath the surface in classical Hollywood films is a critic called Parker Tyler.
I'm so glad you brought him up.
Who's, very much of that generation of great post-war American critics, along with Manny Farber and Sarris, but tends to largely be forgotten today. And he's somebody who very well articulated the idea that, for example, like Hollywood films were cultivating bisexual desire, whether they stated that they were doing so or not, or that Hollywood films very often had erotic narratives that ran counter to what the official narratives of the movie were. So, for example, he has a great read of Double Indemnity, where the film is all about Edward G. Robinson and Fred McMurray, and Barbara Stanwyck is really just a beard. Like Parker Tyler was a fantastic diviner of the texts beneath the text in so much of classic Hollywood.
Yeah, it's really not as known as it should be, text, the book, and I think I'm so glad you brought him up. I'm going to open it up to questions because there might be some. Yes? Criticism as thirst.
For the movie, for writing, for life, like just as a genre. Because I feel like there's like neutral objectivity, and then there's something else that's more effective or affective
I think Kale's a really good point of reference for that, and she's someone who I disagree with on many things, but always used this phrase, saphead objectivity, the idea being there's no such thing. You're going into the movie theater, you're having that confrontation with the work, and it's going to be filtered through you whether you like it or not, so you might as well lean into it. And though I think so few of her value judgments stand up, one thing that I think she's fundamentally right about is not only that, but leaning into the basic sensual and absorbing process that is, being in a dress with a film, and accepting that and not trying to. And I think what she was really pushing back against at the time was this sort of gentleman critic tradition. The idea that you could swan into a movie theater and you could have this sort of elevated interaction with the film, but it wasn't going to take you over. You weren't going to give yourself over to it because you were, the gentleman critic. You weren't going to let this thing get it over on you. And I think that is a fight worth picking.
And also, I think like a lot of other forms of journalism, the objective perspective is always the one that's like white, straight, male. And so a lot of there's like no such thing as like me going into a movie with that sort of objectivity, because it doesn't exist.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like what you're asking is the difference between, as a former academic, I feel like that is where I always had to divorce myself from just questions of pleasure broadly. Like if you're in class, it doesn't matter if you liked Moby Dick, it matters if you can tell me what the hell this Whaling chapter is about. Like the understanding as a counterpoint to pleasure, where I think that the best criticism certainly knows how to merge the two. I think a lot about, I rewatched Johnny Guitar recently, and I realized for the first time the burst of pleasure that I feel when she changes into like the yellow blouse with like the red kerchief it's not like sexual attraction, but there's a form of just arousal that I feel like is what the movie is very specifically trying to do. Mm-hmm. And so if I ever wrote about it, I would have to, it's like objectively this is a thing that is happening in the movie, but once we get that out of the way, everything that I describe, or my way into relaying that to a reader, is all about the not objective,
how
the very
pleasurable it is.
subjective.
Yeah,
right.
how satisfying
James
it is.
Baldwin writing about Joan Crawford's back,
Right.
like
Her
classic
cheeks.
example. Her cheeks, yeah, these are classic.
Or just like the way that like the line reading of like "lie to me" in that movie is like, how could you not be like brokenhearted and turned on at the same time by how erotic that movie is? And like, are you being objectively correct about a movie like Red River if you're not picking up on the sexual undertones of that movie? You're not, but I also don't want to only rely on an analysis of form to tell me why there's this buried text in that movie. You have to be relying on some subjective, experiential resources in yourself to really, I think, unpack that. To really get at the subtext of things, you have to go beyond the objective, I think.
Has anyone written well on Marilyn Monroe who you can think of?
Norman Mailer.
Oh.
As the token straight white man. Gotta plug my boy.
I would really love to know if there's more great writing on her, because I think that she is like the perfect example of how to. It's like you can't be objective about Marilyn Monroe because there's so much going on with her physical presence, her voice. Like you can get the words on the page that are accurate descriptions of what's happening, but you're nowhere near the essence of her if you're not if you're not thinking about how she's making you feel. I was rewatching parts of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes because in preparation for this panel, actually, I was watching the gymnastics scene, one of the horniest scenes in a movie that I can think of, certainly for me.
Does anyone, if you want to describe it for people who aren't familiar with it?
I forget why she goes to the gymnasium. That I forget all of it. I just
think
know
she's
that
just looking for a man.
Yeah, looking for a man, and all male gymnasts tumbling, very hairy and beautiful, and there's a crowd of women in the gymnasium like her staring at these bodies. It is an insanely horny scene, and it. How do you talk about her pleasure within the scene without understanding your pleasure? You can talk about how her eyes widen when a guy makes a bicep, with like the cartoon version, but
also let's talk about Tashlin. That's more cinema, but yeah, that reminds me of Tashlin making. To film. I guess Tashlin gets into the other part of film criticism and less, which is just like cheeky innuendos and puns.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's also a part of it, but a fun part of it.
Yeah, that's why Lubitsch is so horny to me.
Right.
Clooney Brown, when I saw that for the first time, I wasn't ready for the erotics of the double entendres and the plumbing jokes and I just wasn't ready for how it worked that way.
I feel like good criticism kind of also takes that same form sometimes. I feel like I love the old-fashioned, play of words. I feel like great criticism is often a bit lowbrow,
Very recently, in this whole awful Scorsese MCU flap, Marvel Comics Universe flap, there was a news cycle where people went around asking various notable filmmakers about superhero films, essentially. And the one good response, and it was a very good one, came from Pedro Almodovar, of course, whose response was the essence of it, I'll paraphrase, they're not good movies because nobody fucks in them.
I will say that was my story. And this, I promise you, we just reposted it. We were talking about this months ago.
Yeah.
And it was different. But no, I thought that was hilarious that he immediately, it's not about whether the movie is, whether these movies work or not. He's like, they're just dull. No one has any sexuality, no one has any life, there's no pleasure. People just walk around going from place to place to place. And ultimately, he was like, "That's just no fun for me."
Well, I also think he's saying.
Sense.
Well, he's also saying I think that's his direct answer to the Scorsese thing of they're not cinema, and Almodovar is saying they're not cinema because they're not sexy.
There's no desire.
Cinema is sexy. There's bodies and desire. I think that's how I interpret his comments.
I bring this up because it seems to me, in many ways, there is a tepidity, especially in American movies, especially over, say, the last 20 years, with regards to depiction of desire, particularly in the multiplex. I mean, particularly in the movies that are available to be seen by the vast majority of Americans. And I've never known exactly what to do with this. I have my theories.
Well,
I think we're Puritans.
I think we are, but I think that even within the superhero genre, it hasn't always been that way. The first movie I ever saw in a theater was Batman Returns. Michelle Pfeiffer as Catwoman with Michael Keaton as Batman was verging on S&M in places. There's this acid thing. There's a lot going on in that film. The next Batman movie I saw, Batman Forever, stars Nicole Kidman as a woman who pulls the bat signal for a booty call because she's horny for Batman. So it doesn't have to be the way these movies currently are. Or Ang Lee's Hulk, Jennifer Connelly's attraction to her ex-boyfriend who becomes the Hulk, and this weird manifestation of his sexual energy as the Hulk, the fact that every time he stops being a Hulk, he's spent, he's panting. It's very, there's nothing, I think this is, I think what Almodovar is getting at is that the aesthetic has to be tied to the erotic in some way. Not sex per se, but there has to be an erotics to these things.
Yeah, true. I think the difference in the superheroes, I could be totally wrong, but my uneducated guess would be that it has to do with international market and censors and just making things that are
also,
just
these
products.
movies are made so rapidly.
Yeah.
And that happens so often. There's sort of I think
They all have to fit together in a certain way.
No, true, and they're just kind of, yeah, by road. Yes, Jordan.
I wanted to talk about rom-coms a little bit because they haven't come up at all. It seems weird. So I do a podcast on rom-coms, like bad romantic comedies, and it's an interesting thing because people will come up to us and they'll be like, "Oh, you want to talk about this movie? This movie's bad, and this is why." And a lot of rom-coms are considered to be bad for a lot of like really, I think, mundane plot reasons. But when we talk about it on the podcast, we talk a lot about like whether or not the film succeeds or fails at making us like feel like the leads want to fuck or making us want to fuck the leads. And a lot of like rom-coms, like whether or not they fail at the plot level, like 27 Dresses, which like doesn't make any sense. There's a sense that though, like at like in terms of like all the other Catherine Heigl movies, that was the one where we were like, she actually seems like she would fuck James Marsden, so this is the good one. And that's the one that works. But I think in a lot of the criticism when we talk about this like the implied like, you know, the blonde versus the brunette. It's implied that a blonde is hot. And sometimes a film will put a blonde there and be like, you have to think that she's hot. But the film doesn't give us anything to actually feel like she is. And so like we do a lot of commentary about like how the person in a rom-com, especially like recently within the last 20 years, that's supposed to be hot. They're not framed hot. They're not playing it hot. There's nothing hot about it. So we usually find like a secretary, like a horny secretary or something. That's usually the most interesting character in the modern rom-com because she's usually like acting out of her own desire, and it's not like it's almost like whatever woman you put at the forefront is so pristine in a way that like I don't believe that she can fuck. I don't believe that like Jennifer Lopez in The Wedding Planner fucks.
No.
I don't believe that she does.
No.
So like,
No.
so it's just an interesting like it's an interesting thing because like we see that like superhero movies have taken over the cinema and rom-coms have been pushed out and a lot of them are on streaming now, and I still find the issue with them where like I'll watch the new Four Weddings and a Funeral and everyone's beautiful but there's just no sexual energy
Yeah.
there, and it just makes everything die.
What's the last rom-com with sexual energy that you think you've seen, or to be released?
I think To All the Boys I'd Loved Before. I thought
Sure.
but no, I had the same problem with Always Be My Maybe. I liked it. I thought it was like funny, but there's just no way they're gonna kiss. Like,
Absolutely not. Yeah.
it was like, what like these are two friends just hanging out. Like, okay, that's fine.
It's not a rom-com, but maybe The Notebook. Maybe.
Oh wow.
The Notebook is actually like really interesting because people, you know, it's considered to be a really bad film, but I believe that they fucking
Yeah.
But also the metatext around
Yeah.
their like
And let's
Yeah.
talk about the
their
metatext. Yeah,
kiss,
that was
their like
a
MTV
moment.
best kiss was like, what? Like,
Yeah.
Twilight is
Oh.
that they, oh, that's true. And also
Yeah.
the metatext around it. But also, again, not rom-coms. Rom-coms is interesting because, like, the whole genre is, like, when, like, you know, going from pre-code to when banter is replacing sex, you know? And, like, so that's so much of a part of it. And I think that got lost at some point. That's a very interesting point.
I mean, to speak of another even more disappeared really genre or subgenre is like I'm a child of the golden age of the erotic thriller,
Right.
which are, you know, in 1994, people would watch entire 100-minute narrative films hoping to see a glimpse of Linda Fiorentino's left breast, and that's just not a thing that happens anymore. And I can't help but think the ubiquity of internet pornography has a little bit to do with that.
Interesting.
I do have some sense that as that has become the pressure release valve for a lot of people's fantasy lives, that you've seen a slow drain of any sort of sexuality from mainstream cinema at the very least.
I think part of it too, and maybe I'm wrong, but a lot of actresses aren't willing to go, like, to be fully nude, and a lot of actors are so hesitant too. I think I remember like a Nicole Kidman interview where she was like maybe the only actress who was like willing to do that, and also she said, I want more erotic thrillers,
Right.
which HBO Max, I mean, come on, let's get after it. But that's really interesting.
I heard she still wants to do that. Amazon, that's her goal, is to bring back that for home streaming.
I would love that, because I totally think the fall of the erotic thriller is related to the fall of the rom-com and right, the rise of just the availability of, I mean, if movie stardom, if box office stardom is about the person that makes you want to leave the house to pay the money to see the movie, if that is bound up with sexuality and you can get that at home, then that's a problem for like the idea of movie stardom that's tied to sexuality in that way. And I think a lot about, it is wild to me that like Basic Instinct was one of the hugest movies of that year, because it's just such a different landscape than what we have now. Part of the reason I think that, for me, movie stardom, I guess the last time I can remember people going in throngs to see a star in a movie for reasons of sex is probably Halle Berry and Swordfish. Like, I can't think of a time since then that like you're gonna see a boob became the thing that was all over the TV, that was all over the barbershop, that like, you know, you're gonna see Halle Berry's boob like for a second. But that movie made money accordingly. I can't think of the last time that has made people go to the movies. And I think that's totally tied to things like box office stardom, and I really would love for erotic thrillers to come back. I would love for Sharon Stone to kill some people in a movie.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I mean, just the mention of Twilight and the phenomenon that those films were, I think, speaks to the fact that there is no small desire still out there to see films about people palpably hot for one another who are palpably hot. But it seems, again, that so much sexuality is just immigrated out of our cinema.
Well, it's too bad.
The Lighthouse, if not one of the most erotic movies.
I haven't seen it. It's homoerotic list.
I think so.
That's what I've heard. I haven't seen it yet.
Like, there's so many parts where Willem Dafoe is talking about how beautiful Robert Pattinson is. Just like you're too pretty for this line of work. You're too pretty.
Willem Dafoe just saying what we're all thinking.
Let's, is there another question? We're gonna have to wrap soon. Yes, and I think this will have to be the last question, I'm afraid. Go ahead. That's a very fascinating question. Did everyone hear it? What? I know, no, that's okay. We stopped it early enough. We can dive into this. That everyone, it was the question about how a lot of the examples have been about white bodies on screen, and what are some of the differences in describing people of color, their bodies on screen.
For me, it's not a difference of how I describe things, but it's more a difference of how and whether movies sexualize or make those bodies erotic in a non-colonializing way in the first place. I mean, I think a lot about like the moment of Denzel when I was growing up, like his gorgeousness in his earlier roles, but also through the 90s, and the ways that I would hear him talked about just didn't always transfer to some of the more Hollywood-y movies that we were seeing, or rather it just felt like, for example, for Black Bodies, I just feel like there are things that happen in Black movies that don't happen with those actors when they leave Black movies. And so it would always be pretty specific. Like, I'm trying to think of a time in like a non-Black movie that Black actors have been, there's a sex scene in Miami Vice between Naomi Harris and Jamie Foxx that surprised me because it was Miami Vice, but a long sex scene between two Black people in a way that I'd never seen a white director do that. And that was like genuinely erotic to me. And it's a long sex scene. They go from the bed to the shower. I don't know if this is just like the director's cut, but it's pretty intense.
There's a fake out in the middle
Yeah,
of it.
it's like a whole drama unto itself. But But it's interesting because I've never felt like Jamie Foxx, Naomi Harris. These are people who in other movies. Well, Naomi Harris in the James Bond movies actually I think is really sexy, but it's about her interactions with Daniel Craig. It's not just about her. So for me, it's always about like the I guess my suspicion of the context of the bodies, because it's like less a matter of the innate eroticism of racism, more just the ways that films as an apparatus have been set up to eroticize certain bodies in some ways and other bodies in other ways. Like I feel like a lot of the erotics of black men, for example, is the same that you get in like gay porn. It's like the very thug thing that a lot of America seems, not just America, seems to be obsessed with eroticizing in a very like Mandingo-y way that makes me feel really weird always whenever I see it, versus the ways that I feel like in Devil Wears a Blue Dress, Denzel, and and the sleeveless undershirt has never been sexier to me on screen, but it's a completely different context from the kind of sexy that would get you on People magazine. It doesn't seem like the same conversation even to me.
That came up a lot. There was a panel in the Black Creators Forum just before the festival about Black masculinity on film, and a lot of that, no one used the word Mandingo, but there was a way that Black male bodies were described on screen that was very similar vein, similar description. So yeah, film criticism is dependent on the images it's given,
Yeah.
and that's very tricky in the context. Yes? Sorry? Yes, you can be the last comment question.
But to touch on what she said about the minority and has there been any films that highlighted any sexism, I would say there have been so many different approaches to sexuality in modern film, and some of it I think is very graphic. And I do believe that we are moving to such to feeling comfortable with the body. I, being a little old-fashioned, kind of think, and looking at some of the more modern videography, I'm like, this is kind of graphic. And where do you draw the line? So, but I'll just say this. In Roots, when I believe the character was Matilda, when she was very aged. I think she hadn't seen her husband or the whole Turkish George in probably 30 years. But in the last scene of her and him, if you want to touch on intimacy, I found it to be, I think she was very gray, and the film showed her age considerably, as well as him. But when they made love, it was just enough to take the breath away. Because you were thinking, is she ever going to see Chicken George again? Or when he showed up on the shore, and he showed up in Henderson, Tennessee, but it was something that she was living for. But it was, the highlight was when they got into bed. I was like, they're too old to do anything. What are they going to do, hug? Just to add to the forum, it's something to take with me when I continue to visit my creative writing. I would like to add more sexism. I do want to add a respectable approach to it. Because in looking at the modern footage, you see on some of the videos, the butt shaking, it's like, hands in the butt. But you can't say in so many films
It's true. Prince and Pants era, it's true. Okay,
I'm going to say thank you.
Yes, thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. No, thank you so much. I'm hearing a lot in what you're saying, a lot of different things that we've touched on, and there's definitely like criticism and our dependence on people like movie makers and images for this, and the tendency to fetishize certain body parts, which we didn't really talk about, and certain body parts get ignored in that fetishization. But also I thought it was very interesting, we talked about Roots and what you talked about Miami Vice, about when you said that, you know, the scare, like there's narrative in these things, and that's when you talk about internet porn, what's missing is the style and narrative. I mean, or at least in a skillful, interesting way. And I feel like that's when film criticism is able to identify that style and that narrative that's so key for lust, that it's so important. I just want to, we have to end, but I want to thank our panelists and thank all of you for this really wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Miriam.
Hey, do you guys mind getting just a picture of the three of you real quick outside? Okay.